Bitcoin down significantly, over 3% this morning, 8,314, and gold also takes a hit, but we're still close to a 7-year high. What in the gold spot price, 1,531 for gold.
Bitcoin got absolutely crushed yesterday, literally decimated, and then some, falling from $9,765 down today to $8,315. But this kind of volatility is nothing new for crypto traders. Let's get down to Anna Edwards right now. She is standing by on the green in Westminster, and as we were talking about at the top of the show, the UK Supreme Court has ruled that Prime Minister Boris Johnson gave bad advice to the Queen, and then she, for some reason, took that advice, and now she's not being held responsible, but he is.
I'm just having you chatting about the Queen.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, I just don't understand, because she's not just the Queen of England, which is a pretty big deal. She's the head of the church. I mean, she's there by divine intervention. The idea is God put her there.
Well,
and yet
that sounds like a
Yes.
subject of a thesis rather than the 40 seconds I have to give you the latest from Westminster. But yeah, the crucial detail, I suppose, is that Boris Johnson is supposed to be her chief advisor, and if he is giving bad advice to the Queen, advice that was deemed to be unlawful and to have broken the law, then that's why we're seeing calls for him to resign, calls for his advisors to resign, calls for the people like Geoffrey Cox, Dominic Cummings to resign, his advisors they are. Also calls for Jacob Rees-Mogg to resign. We know he's described what we heard at the Supreme Court yesterday as a coup. No sign that any of those people are going anywhere. But we will be watching Boris Johnson as he flies back from New York. We don't know if he's going to speak in the House of Commons later today, but we will have a statement from Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House. Michael Gove said this morning that the government will set out its plan from here. Parliament will start to sit from 11:30 a.m. local time. Big question really is, what will the Rebel Alliance, that grouping, that loose grouping of opposition MPs and ex-Tory MPs who were united only in the pursuit of blocking no deal, will they remain united? Will they find other common cause? And what kind of legislative path or otherwise will they take in pursuit of that? So that's what we're watching out for here in Westminster.
Yeah, if it was going to get any more complicated, it basically is. Thank you so much, Anna Edwards, live from Westminster for us this morning. And I'm pleased to say that we have joining us this morning Ben Page, who is the CEO of Ipsos Mori, the polling group, with us, who can potentially answer some of the questions around what happens next, and especially the idea of, we're likely to be into election territory now here in the UK.
We are. Exactly when isn't clear, given that the opposition have said that they aren't immediately going to try and trigger an election by winning a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons. But no, one is coming, absolutely. The opposition parties in the House of Commons want it to be after they've absolutely guaranteed that a no-deal Brexit happens on the 31st, does not happen on the 31st of October. But what's interesting is that until this latest judgment by the Supreme Court, all of the stuff that has gone before, the fire, the fury, the cancelling of Parliament, etc., hasn't actually shifted the polls. So Boris Johnson remained with about, in our polling, and we were the most accurate in May at the European elections, with a 10-point lead over Labour. And so it may be that despite the public agreeing that the Supreme Court was right, it's not actually going to change the price of fish in terms of political support. But we'll see.
I don't know too terribly much about parliamentary procedure. What happens if Boris Johnson resigns now? Doesn't that leave the United Kingdom without a prime minister? Wouldn't they have to hold elections sooner than later?
Well, no, because then in theory, the opposition can then put somebody forward to form a government. So that if he's not going to, if nobody else came forward inside the Conservative Party, and that wasn't possible, given that they've now not got a majority, if the other side could cobble together a compromise, and the name of Margaret Beckett, former deputy leader of the Labour Party, has been touted this morning as a sort of compromise, neutral candidate just to get us through the 31st of October deadline and extend the discussions with the European Union so that we don't leave. That would be a possibility. But to be quite honest, the chances of Boris Johnson resigning, unless somebody literally puts a gun to his head, I think are almost zero. This is a man who has worked all his life for this job. He's not going to give up,
and he's not going to, on the front page of the newspapers, they're counting the number of days that he's been in office, and were he to resign, he would be, the shortest Prime Minister in history, etc. But the other point is that if he were
you read the Daily Mirror too.
The Daily Mail, yeah. Yes, I try to read all the newspapers, or at least have a look at the headlines. Look, the other thing, though, is that, we skirted over the issue that it would be another Conservative who would potentially take over, because if Boris Johnson were to resign, it would be somebody from his own party who could then potentially try to lead too. So there's a few stages, right?
Absolutely. It's just not clear. There's even another scenario where he gets suspended from the Prime Minister gets suspended from the House of Commons for a few days for contempt of Parliament. So there will be all sorts of votes today. But ultimately, we have to see what, after all of this dust, all of this has gone through, are the Conservatives still ahead in the polls? Because that's crucial. And actually, it's what Boris Johnson wants. He wants an election to try and secure a majority to get through all this from his perspective.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. That's Ben Page, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Ipsos Mori.
I've got to come in here with some breaking news on oil. You may see price fluctuation now. Saudi Aramco has reached production capacity, or come back to production capacity of more than 11 million barrels a day ahead of schedule. So it's a self-imposed schedule. It was a deadline that they have beaten by about a week, according to people with knowledge of the situation who declined to be identified. Bloomberg's Anthony DePaula reporting this all-important oil headline. So Saudi Aramco has restored production capacity of more than 11 million barrels a day ahead of schedule. Abqaiq is the field, of course, that was attacked by Iran, according to the United States, Germany, France, the UK, etc. It has 4.92 million barrels a day of capacity as available now, and Khurais has 1.3 million barrels a day of capacity as available now. But overall, Saudi Aramco's capacity now exceeds 11 million barrels a day, and they're coming out with this headline. If we look at oil prices here, we see Brent crude now coming down to $62.08 a barrel, which makes sense because the limited capacity was really the concern on the supply-demand curve. And we see NYMEX WTI coming down to $56.52.
Okay, so look, that's geopolitical risk, essentially, isn't it? So let's bring in our guest who's here in the London studio, Hugh Gimber, who's from JP Morgan Asset Management, Global Market Strategist. We have political risk in the UK, in the US, also geopolitical risks and tensions over Iran and in Saudi Arabia. I noticed that Goldman Sachs President and COO saying that these global risks are growing for investors. I mean, could we have been in a quiet period for geopolitics?
So I think when you think about the way geopolitics is going to impact markets, the macro piece is also very important there, because it's times when the macro data is weakening, the geopolitics really becomes able to upset markets much more. If we were in a period where global growth was ticking along really nicely, economies were growing healthily, then I think you'd see less of an impact in the markets than we are today.
Where do you see the best place to hide your money if these geopolitical risks flare up in a more concerning way?
So for me, the US looks best positioned at the moment, both in terms of fixed income markets and in equity markets, because it's really the traditional playbook for investors. When tensions rise and when investors become more jittery, you do tend to see that sort of safe haven flow back into US assets. And from an equity period of uncertainty, it stands better to perform well.
Okay, but then should we be so gloomy? Christine Lagarde speaking to Bloomberg, speaking to Francine Lacroix, we've been playing out the sound of that interview. Obviously, she's headed to the ECB. It is not in the baseline to have a recession. So do we actually dodge a global economic downturn?
So I certainly don't think it's a given that we move into a downturn, because so far there's a lot of noise at the moment, but I'm not sure how much signal we're actually getting from, just take the last couple of days as an example. From a political perspective, there's been some really meaningful stories, but I don't think the picture for the global economy has been shifted significantly by the headlines that we've seen over the past couple of days. For us to move into that recessionary scenario potentially next year, trade is really the key issue that I will be watching, because I think that's the geopolitical risk that's had the most drag on global growth and on global markets so far.
Are you concerned about a recession in 2020?
I think we're right to be concerned about a recession, because the slowdown in the economy does seem to be broadening. So I think there are good reasons to be concerned. The way I'm thinking about it when talking to investors and clients is sort of not de-risking aggressively at this stage, because I think there are reasons why you could see this just be a sort of a slowdown into below trend but still positive growth. And so bringing that back to asset allocation, that means that we're trying to find ways in which investors can still be exposed to some upside, still have some equity allocation, but not being overly geared to cyclical parts of the economy.
Okay, you mentioned the US-China trade story being, the most significant drag for markets at the moment. I mean, do you see clients, are you thinking about, are you enacting divestment of assets exposed to China? Are you ramping back when it comes to exposure of China or not?
So on China, for me, it's all about time horizon, because if you're thinking about trying to call the next, say, 3 to 6 months, I think China and emerging markets are in a fairly tricky spot, because if we do see any further escalation on trade, then I think those regions will suffer. That being said, the long-term potential of China and other emerging markets such as India, I don't see as it's not really been upset by this issue. So on a 10 to 15 year basis, we're actually seeing some clients thinking that this might be an interesting time to step in.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time, both on Bloomberg Television and here with us on Bloomberg Radio. Hugh Gimber, J.P. Morgan Asset Management Global Market Strategist.
Markets, headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app and at TikTok on Twitter. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters here in London, I'm Caroline Hepker with this Bloomberg Radio Business Flash. So we have political turmoil in the United States and in the UK hitting risk appetite globally. Currently, we are down in terms of European equities by 1.1% on the Euro Stoxx 600. FTSE 100 also declines by 0.8%. Xetra DAX down 0.9%. And the CAC 40 in Paris is off by 1.3%. It follows on from the weak equity trading session that we saw over in Asia. Even the news around China potentially planning to buy more US pork, so a slight easing of the US-China trade talks, that was not enough to boost Asian equity markets this morning. This, of course, after yesterday's announcement from the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announcing a formal impeachment process against the US president, which saw the S&P 500 fall the most in a month. In terms of futures, looking ahead to the US market open, we're into negative territory. We're down by just over 0.1% for S&P 500 E-mini futures, although actually earlier this morning they had been pointing to a higher open, but we're increasingly sort of negative as we go through the day. Now, let's not forget the comments that we've had from a number of central bank governors, from Philip Lowe saying that Australia's economy is at a gentle turning point, also hints and speculation of an interest rate cut in October, following on from Haruhiko Kuroda's comments from the BOJ earlier this morning. And in terms of yields this morning, in Europe, German benchmark yields negative 61 basis points, down by a basis point, and US yields are trading at 1.64% on the 10-year benchmark. And I was saying to Matt earlier, gold is weaker but still close to pretty high levels, 1,531 per troy ounce, and Bitcoin hit hard, down 2.7%, trading at 8,348. So that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now here's Leanne Gerrans with more on what's going on around the world. Good morning.
Good morning, Caroline. Caroline. President Donald Trump faces an impeachment inquiry. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says he's violated his oath of office. This amid allegation the president urged Ukraine's leader to probe presidential hopeful Joe Biden. Trump says he'll release a transcript of his phone call with Ukraine's president today. He denies allegations of any wrongdoing. President Emmanuel Macron is stepping up efforts to diffuse tensions with Iran. He met with the Islamic Republic's leader right after meeting President Trump. Macron saying it would be a lost opportunity if President Rouhani left New York without meeting his American counterpart. And WeWork's chief Adam Newman is out. The company is replacing its controversial chief with 2 senior executives. That's in an attempt to salvage its embattled IPO. The company plans to go ahead with the listings, but we've been told it's unlikely to take place next month as planned. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg Opinion, informed perspectives, and expert data-driven commentary on breaking news.
It's just gone 9:20 in the city of London. Time to check in with Bloomberg Opinion. We're joined by columnist Leonid Bershidsky, who's writing about the U.S. as a corrupting influence on Ukraine. And also, you've got a great column, I think,